everybody. We're going to be going through Bible survey this week, which is just what is the main story of the Bible, right? And so the textbook that I suggested, or the suggested reading, or however you want to phrase that, is The Drama of Scripture. And so it's a great book that basically covers this, right, of what is the story of Scripture, what is that consistent narrative throughout all of Scripture. And the picture here is kind of a crazy picture, but it's the cover of the book, so that's why I picked it. But this is it's a painting of the parable of the tenants. And I'm not entirely sure why they picked that for the cover of their book, but I figured if I'm using that book, I might as well use their graphic. So the prologue, the Bible as a grand story. First, we're going to talk about what is the Bible a little bit, and kind of unpack that, and then we'll talk about sort of opening up the first bit of it, like what are we doing when we're reading the early parts of Scripture. So I also sent ahead lecture notes, and so text reading, drama 17 to 23, that's just the section from the textbook that this lecture is based off of. And then these other abbreviations, there's some other readings that you can select if you want that I sent ahead, and you can read those as well. There's just a few other like short essays and that kind of thing that cover this topic as well. So before we get into all of that, it's usually worthwhile to explain who I am, so that way you know at least why I'm here and why you're listening to me. So my name is Ryan Litton. I'm a professor at Life Pacific University of Virginia. I've been teaching there for 10 years now. I teach Bible, theology, church history, just a whole lot of stuff. And I love it. This is my dream job in my hometown. You can't beat it. My goal in life, basically my theme verse or life verse, if you want to call it that, would be in Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says that God has given the apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and pastors for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry. So equipping the saints for the work of the ministry is really kind of where I see myself. That's what I want to do with my life. I want to help people be better Christians so that they can go out and help other people, right? That's what I want to do. And so when I was offered this opportunity, I mean, this is like just right in my wheelhouse, right? Coming and talking to Christians about how to be better Christians, how to better read the Bible, that sort of thing. This is what I want to do with my life. So I'm excited to do this. I married my wife Samantha in 2008. My son, John Marshall, was born in 2014. He was named after my father and my grandfather. Amelia Isley was born in 2016. She was named after a character in Doctor Who and a location in Star Wars. And so that's the kind of family that we are. My wife actually came up with that name, Amelia Isley. So we're both just as nerdy as the other one. My master's degree is basically in church history. Technically, it's a master's in Christian thought, but within the division of Christian thought, what I focused on was early church history, specifically church history from 180 to 880. So that's what my master's degree is. It's from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I'm also currently working on a PhD through an Australian school called Ridley College, and my program is just writing the dissertation, so there's no coursework. I don't have to do any classes or anything like that. I'm just going to write my dissertation, which, is just 100,000 words. So, I'll be done this weekend, right? No, it's going to take me like 4 years or so, 5 years to get through that. But I'm loving it so far. This picture of us, this is Halloween. I'm dressed up as Fat Thor because Marvel finally provided me someone that I could dress up as for Halloween, because this isn't really a Chris Hemsworth body, but for that one character it is. My wife is wearing her Harry Potter robe, so she's dressed up as a character from Harry Potter. And then my son decided to dress up like the skeleton because reasons, I don't know. He has an Iron Man outfit and Captain America and Spider-Man and all that. And for whatever reason, he wanted to be a skeleton. So, okay. And then my daughter is a mermaid. So that's my family. And wish they could be with me. Maybe if I come out again, we'll have them come with me, or at least my wife. Maybe we can leave the kids behind. That'd be great. So, like I said, to start with, we're going to do some basic information about the Bible. It's good to just know basically what the Bible is. And the longer that I've taught, the more I've realized that you can't assume this stuff anymore. That there's a lot of stuff that people just aren't aware of when it comes to the Bible. So we shouldn't think of the Bible as a book. We should think of it as a collection of books. Though we would say that God is the author of all of Scripture. Right? Paul says that all Scripture is God-breathed, God-inspired. So we would say God's the author of all of Scripture. It's also a collection of individual writings by individual people. So we should think about it collectively, that we're reading Paul, we're reading Peter, we're reading John. And all of those different authors, whether they knew it or not, are pointing towards Jesus. That's sort of the lens that we're going to use for the story of Scripture, the drama of Scripture, is everything is pointing us towards Jesus. What we see in Galatians, Paul says that the law was a tutor leading us to Christ. And the word that he uses there is a servant that would escort children from home to school. Basically a protector, someone who's sort of a guide. That person's not responsible for teaching, that person's responsible for keeping you safe and getting you from point A to point B. And that, for Paul, is what the law is. That's what the Old Testament is for Paul. So I think the best way for us to look at the overall story of Scripture is to say all of Scripture exists to point us to Jesus. All of Scripture exists to sort of protect us and move us along a path towards Jesus. Right? Scripture itself is not our idol. We do not worship the Bible. We worship the one to whom the Bible points. Right? So the Bible is pointing us towards Jesus, and that's who we worship. There are 66 books of the Bible. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. I'll give you a really, really cheesy Sunday school way of remembering that. How many letters are in Old? 3. How many letters are in Testament? 9. So 3 and 9, you get 39, right? Well, with New Testament, how many letters are in New? Still 3, right? How many letters are in Testament? 9. 3 times 9 is 27. So 3 and 9 gives you 39. 3 times 9 gives you 27. That's how you can remember how many books are in the Old Testament, how many books are in the New Testament. It's really cheesy, just sort of happens to work out that way, but it's a nice little thing. I actually learned that literally in Sunday school when I was like 6, and it's just stuck with me ever since, because I thought, that's just such a neat coincidence. Like, that's just such a neat, anyway. There are approximately 40 authors, give or take, depending on, there's some things in the New Testament that we debate whether or not Paul actually wrote that thing, or, that sort of thing. 2 Peter is debated as to whether or not it's the same person as 1 Peter. So approximately 40 authors. There are 3 languages used. Anybody know what those 3 languages are?
Hebrew, Greek.
Hebrew, Greek. The third one's harder. What? Aramaic. Yeah. Yeah, there's some parts of Daniel that are Aramaic, and there's some parts, there's like one verse in Genesis that's Aramaic, and then I think Nehemiah, there's a little bit of Nehemiah that's in Aramaic, but mostly it's Daniel. There's a large section of Daniel where it literally says, basically, the next section is in Aramaic, right? And it just switches to Aramaic. So those are the 3 languages that are used. And it spans probably about 1,500 years. So we've got a lot of time here. And if you think about just English, if you were to go back and try to read English from 1,000 years ago, you go read actual Old English like Beowulf, you're going to have a hard time, right? Like, it's not really going to work. Because it's not the same language, right? You can maybe chart the progress of like one word to the next or something, but it's not the same language anymore. So imagine like 1,500 years with the Old Testament. When you're reading Deuteronomy versus when you're reading Isaiah, that language is very different. When I learned Hebrew in seminary and I read Deuteronomy, I was like, oh, this isn't that bad. And then I picked up Isaiah and I was like, I'm going to go back to English because I don't know what's happening right now. This is bizarre. And so there's a lot of diversity across the time of Scripture. And then, of course, into the New Testament, right? Switching to a different language, working off of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that sort of thing. One of the things that you'll notice is there's a distinction between Old and New Testament. This is, while it's necessary, this sometimes gets in our way because we tend to think that the Old Testament is worse and the New Testament is better. This is a really big problem. because the Old Testament is 2/3 of the Bible. And so when we make 2/3 of the Bible less than, we're really cheating ourselves. The Devo that I did for the first year students this morning was out of Exodus 34. And it's a fantastic passage, and I think we should read things like Exodus more often. Right? Now, are there things that are in the Old Testament that are boring? Yes, there absolutely are. Right? Some of the parts of Leviticus, like, just no thanks. Right? But there's lots of stuff in the Old Testament that's fantastic. To give you just one example, a favorite example of how the Old Testament is really helpful for us is when we read Exodus 20, which is the Ten Commandments. The first line of the Ten Commandments is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's before any of the commandments are given. Now, if we just reflect on that for a minute, God did not go to Egypt, to the Israelites, and say, you're in slavery, you want to get out, here's some laws, obey them for 50 years, and if you're good at that, I'll come back and I'll help you. Right? No, he delivered them from Egypt, and then once he had completed the deliverance, he said, here's who I am. I'm your God. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. I'm the one that rescued you from slavery. Now here's what I would like you to do. Right? And so that sort of thing, to me, I think sets up for us this standard of deliverance precedes expectations. And we tend to flip that. We think that the Old Testament is full of rules where you've got to do this, and if you don't do this, then God's not going to treat you in a good way, right? Well, that's not how the law works, though, right? The law is after God actually doing something for you. God delivers them from Egypt and then says, here are some of the things that I would like you to do. Here's the way I would like you to live your life. And we see that continued in the New Testament when Jesus heals people, right? He says, go and sin no more, right? We don't see Jesus saying, leprosy, that's a bummer. Tell you what, get your act together, come back to me in 2 weeks, and I'll sort this out for you, right? No, he heals them, and then he says, go and sin no more, right? Deliverance, and then expectations. And so I think if we reframe the way that we look at the Old Testament, if we thought about it instead as like the First Testament, right? Or something like that, where it's not using like something like old. Now, obviously, we're not going to turn that boat around, like everybody's going to still call it the Old Testament. But if you can just start to like change your perspective on what you think of when you say Old Testament, right? What you think of when you hear somebody say Old Testament, that's going to help a lot. Because again, 2/3 of the scriptures are the Old Testament. And also, if we want to get right down to it, when Paul's talking about the inspiration of Scripture in 1 Timothy 2, or not 1 Timothy 2, 2 Timothy 3, sorry. 2 Timothy 3, 2 Timothy 3:16 is where he says all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for reproof and yada, yada, yada. When he says that, do you know what he's not talking about? The New Testament. How can we know that Paul's not talking about the New Testament when he writes that? Because it doesn't exist yet, right? Because he's literally writing it, right? So he can't be like self-referential. He can't be talking about the New Testament because it's not done yet. He's talking about the Old Testament. And so when he's writing to the earliest Christians, he's saying, look, all of Scripture is useful. When he says that, he's talking about all of the Old Testament, right? All of the Old Testament is useful for you. If you think about Jesus and the disciples, their Bible was the Old Testament. And so we really have to try to reclaim the Old Testament for ourselves, that we're not seeing it as just sort of like the, boring parts or the genealogies or, that sort of thing. Genealogies actually could be quite fascinating, but we'll talk about that later. So Old Testament, crucial part of God's story, crucial part of the redemptive plan in history. We're going to spend a good bit on the Old Testament and try to trace that story, and then we'll shift to the New Testament. First of all, though, there's this thing called the BibleProject, which I'm not sure if you guys are aware of. If you are not, then welcome to the BibleProject. This is a YouTube channel that is phenomenal. I'm a really big fan of sharing resources, and so, because I don't have all of the answers in the world, but there are a lot of other people out there producing content that have a lot of really great things to say, and so that can be very helpful to us. The BibleProject on YouTube is phenomenal. They have introductions to every book of the Bible. They have short word study videos. They have all sorts of stuff that's just really, really, really helpful. And so in most of the lectures this week, I'll be sharing some brief videos from them that are usually, I think this is a 5 or 6 minute video that just sort of summarizes, like, what is the Bible? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about the Bible? So let's check that out.
The Bible. It's one of the most influential books in human history.
It explores the big questions of why we exist.
It's inspired many people to do amazing things.
And confused many others.
And you've probably got one sitting around somewhere.
So, what is the Bible actually?
Well, the Bible is a small library of books that all emerged out of the history of the people of ancient Israel. And in one sense, they were just like any other ancient civilization. But among them were a long line of individuals called prophets. And they viewed Israel's story as anything but ordinary. They saw it as a central part of what God was doing for all humanity. And these prophets were literary geniuses.
Really?
Yeah, they expertly crafted the Hebrew language to write epic narratives, very sophisticated poetry. They were masters of metaphor and storytelling, and they leveraged all of this to explore life's most complicated questions about death and life and the human struggle.
So, there's a lot of different authors writing this book.
Yeah, and these texts were produced over a 1,000-year period, starting with Israel's origins in Egypt, then leading up to their kingdom with their first temple. But eventually, they were conquered by the Babylonians, who took them away into exile. Then, at a crucial moment in their history, many Israelites returned to their land. They built a second temple, they reformed their identity, and this is when the Jewish scriptures began to be formed into the shape that we have them today.
Okay, the Jewish Bible. What's in it?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called by an acronym, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah, sometimes called the Law. That's Israel's 5-book foundation story. The N stands for Nevi'im, the Hebrew word for prophets. And this section consists of the historical books that tell Israel's story from the prophet's point of view. Then you get the poetic books of the prophets themselves. The K stands for Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. This is a diverse collection of poetic books, wisdom books, and more narrative. And the Jewish people believed that through all of these literary works, God speaks to his people.
Now, there were other Jewish writings being produced during this Second Temple period as well.
Yeah, a really diverse group of texts. And these too were highly valued in Jewish communities. And there was debate from ancient times about whether or not some of these should be considered part of their scriptures.
So, this is a lot of different writings over a long period of time. Why did they put them all together like this?
Well, altogether, these texts tell an epic story about how God is working through these people to bring order and beauty out of the chaos of our world. And it all builds up to a hope for a new leader who would come and renew all creation. And then the Tanakh concludes, and this leader never comes.
So it's an expertly crafted work, but it's missing an ending?
That's exactly right. Now, a few centuries later, a Jewish prophet comes onto the scene named Jesus of Nazareth. He claimed he was carrying the Tanakh story forward.
Yeah, so Jesus did a bunch of cool stuff, was killed, but his followers claimed he was alive from the dead.
Yeah, they said that Jesus was that long-awaited leader who would restore the world. And so his earliest followers, called apostles, they composed new literary works about the story of Jesus. They called these Good News, or the Gospel. They formed an account called Acts about the spread of the Jesus movement outside of Israel. And then they circulated letters to different Jesus communities all around the ancient world.
And they saw these writings as part of the scripture.
Yeah, the apostles wrote all of this as the fulfillment of that epic story found in the Tanakh. And they were continuing the literary genius of the Jewish tradition. They also believed that God was speaking to his people through these texts alongside the scriptures of Israel.
So that's the Old and New Testament. But what did the early Christians think of the other Second Temple literature?
Well, different groups had different views about some of these books, but we know they read them and valued these texts because they passed them along with the Jewish scriptures.
Okay, so we've got the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. We got these other Second Temple period works. Then the writing of the apostles about Jesus. And that's a lot of literature, so what's in my Bible?
So the Christian movement has taken different forms over 2,000 years, and from the beginning, all Christians recognized the Tanakh and the New Testament as scripture. And for centuries, much of the Second Temple literature was read as part of the biblical tradition. The Catholic Church eventually made it official and called some of the books from this collection the Deuterocanonical books. Some Orthodox churches used even more books from this Second Temple literature. And then in the 1500s, during the Reformation, Protestant Christians wanted to go back to the oldest writings of the prophets and apostles, so they accepted only the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, I think I got it. But how does a collection of books produced over 1,000 years by all these different authors tell one unified story?
Yeah, that's the question we'll address in our next video.
Hopefully that video was helpful for you. This is the kind of stuff that they do with all of the books of the Bible, with themes, with all sorts of different stuff, and they're phenomenal. So I highly recommend you checking them out on YouTube. They have a podcast too called My Strange Bible or something like that, which is just fantastic. Any questions thus far up to this point? I know the other Second Temple literature sometimes throws people. That's what you probably have heard of as the Apocrypha. You ever heard anybody talk about the Apocrypha? The other Second Temple literature, that's the Apocrypha. There's also some other literature that doesn't fit into the Apocrypha that's super weird, that pretty much nobody has ever accepted as scripture. And it's called the Pseudepigrapha, which is a big fancy word that means false writings. They're books like, there's one about Solomon battling demons with magic rings, which is like straight up like Lord of the Rings kind of stuff. And pretty much nobody accepts that as scripture, but some people accept the Apocrypha as scripture. And I would say, not that it's scripture, but that it is useful, that it's something that we probably should read. We'll talk about that more when we transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but just to say, if you pick up some of the stuff from the Apocrypha, some of it is really, really helpful. There's one example, just really quick, to give you, a little taste of it, is there's a story in the New Testament with Jesus where the Sadducees and the Pharisees are trying to trap him, which is kind of what they always do, right? And they ask him about, if a man is married to a woman and he dies, and his brother marries the woman and dies, and his brother marries the woman and then dies, and there's 7 brothers, right? Who is going to be married to the woman in heaven, right? I'd always thought that is like the weirdest hypothetical scenario in the world. There's a book in the Apocrypha called Tobit that tells the story of a woman being married to 7 brothers in a row, and all of them die. And in Tobit, it's because there's a demon that is oppressing this woman, and that the 8th person has to overcome the demon. And so there's actually a story that, and I'm not trying to say that Tobit is historical, but in Jesus' time, that is a story that people would have known. So when the Sadducees throw that at Jesus, it's not just some weird hypothetical, it's a story that they would have known, right? And so it actually makes sense of what we're seeing in Scripture. So, how Scripture unfolds. So the way that this book sets things out, and I think this works, is it sets things up as acts. So Act 1 is God establishes his kingdom, and this is focusing on creation. Act 2 is rebellion in the kingdom. This is when sin enters the world. So Act 1 and Act 2 are basically Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then Act 3, the king chooses Israel, and this is God initiating redemption. This goes from Genesis 4 all the way to the end of the Old Testament in Malachi 4. And then we have an interlude, and this is the intertestamental period, or the Second Temple period. So this is, how do we make sense of what's happening in between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament? Because there's a lot of things that happen that really help us to understand what the New Testament's trying to do. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then as we enter Act 4, we have these major themes of kingdom, redemption, land, people, that are all pointing us towards Jesus. Act 4 is the coming of the king. Act 5 is the spreading of the news of the king. And then Act 6 is the return of the king. So these are the acts that we will be walking through in the course this week. The authors of Scripture, as we said, Scripture is a compilation of a lot of different authors. Most of them are Jewish and have a Jewish worldview. It's possible that people like Luke and maybe Mark are not Jewish, but anyone writing in the Old Testament is Jewish, and so they would have an ancient worldview as well as specifically a Jewish worldview. What we have to do in this text, or in reading the text, though, is balance the fact that these people are writing from their perspective with the fact that God is also inspiring this passage, right? And that can get complicated. I don't know if it was one of you, but I was talking to Brenda, and she said somebody asked about the serpent in the garden. Was that one of you guys? No? Yeah. So somebody asked about, like, how do we know that the serpent in Genesis 3 is the devil, is Satan, right? Well, I'll just leave that down there. In Genesis 3, it's probably, in that context, the people that are reading Genesis 3 probably wouldn't read it as Satan, because there's not much of a concept of Satan at this point, right? But when we fast forward and we get to Revelation, I forget what chapter it's in, I think it's later in Revelation, it says Satan, the serpent of old, and it associates Satan directly with the serpent in Genesis 3, right? And so the readers here would associate the serpent with Satan, right? So we would probably make that move here. We wouldn't necessarily make that move here, right? So when we're reading Genesis 3, we have to say the original audience probably wouldn't read this as Satan, even if now we know, looking back on it with a greater amount of information, that it is, right? And so the original author wasn't necessarily thinking Satan, but God was, right? So it's those sorts of things that kind of like, oh, this is challenging, right? Because the human author is saying something and God's taking that thing and potentially doing more with it than what the human author had in mind, right? Another example of this is in Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7, when it talks about the virgin will give birth, the Hebrew word Alma just means young woman. And so it, literally in Hebrew, it's just the young woman will conceive and give birth to a son. Now, in Hebrew, you would assume that an Alma is a virgin because she's not had a husband yet, right? She's young. That's when you transition, basically, in that culture from being a young woman to not being a young woman, to just being a woman, is you're married, right? So you would assume that an Alma's a virgin, but it's not explicit in the text that it's virgin. Well, when we fast forward to Matthew, when Matthew quotes Isaiah, he's writing in Greek, and he uses the word parthenos. In Greek, there are two different words. There's one for young woman, there's one for virgin. And Matthew explicitly chooses the word for virgin. And so, is Isaiah saying that a virgin will conceive and give birth to a son? Maybe, maybe not. But Matthew says that Isaiah was saying that, right? And Isaiah, in his time, is talking about a person in his time. God is taking what Isaiah is saying about someone in his time and also using it to talk about Jesus, right? And so this can get a little complicated when we're dealing with texts, especially from Old Testament and New Testament, when there's what we would call intertextuality, right? Texts in the Old Testament and texts in the New Testament kind of coming together. Now, I know this is a lot that I'm throwing at you. You have questions? Is this kind of making sense? You guys tracking with me here? Yeah. Glad you brought a monster. Yeah, this is tough, right? Like trying to think through, like, what is God doing through this person that they may not be aware of, right? It's challenging, right? But that's what we're doing when we're dealing with the authors of Scripture. The setting of Scripture, this is really challenging, and if we had a lot more time, I would go into a lot more detail about this because This is huge. But culturally speaking, the people who are reading Scripture are not remotely similar to us. They are separated from us geographically, they're separated from us linguistically, they're separated from us culturally, they're separated from us in like virtually every way that you could be separated from a person. And so there are a lot of cultural things in the text that we don't necessarily pick up. Really easy example of this, when you're reading Deuteronomy, there's an instruction in Deuteronomy, I forget exactly where it's at, that says, if your child is disobedient, the mother and the father can take them to the gate of the city, and with the elders of the city can stone the child. And you read that and you're like, that's kind of harsh, right? Like that's kind of harsh. Well, in the ancient world, in literally every other society other than Israel, the father of the house could decide whether or not you lived or died. And so at any point, if you ran afoul of the father, he could kill you, and no one could do anything because he's the father of the house and he gets to do that. So if you upset dad, he can just kill you, right? And so that command in Deuteronomy is actually putting controls on that, right? It's saying the father can't just kill the child. The father and the mother have to agree, and they have to go to the elders of the city, and the elders of the city have to agree with mom and dad, right? And so if this kid's getting stoned, that means that he has run afoul of mom, dad, and all of the important people in the city, right? Like, this is not a small thing. This is not like I lost my temper and I upset my dad, right? Like, this is a big deal. And so there's things like that that are difficult for us to understand coming from our cultural situation because it's just foreign to us, right? It's just foreign to us. If you're interested in seeing some of this kind of stuff, there is a study Bible you can get. If I can learn how to spell here, that'd be helpful. Cultural Background Study Bible. I think they've got 3 or 4 different translations of it at this point. I think NIV, King James, and NRSV. May have ESV as well. But the study notes are all related directly to culture, right? Like, what did circumcision look like in the ancient world? Israelites were not the only people to circumcise. I didn't know that until I started studying this stuff. I just thought circumcision was unique to Israel. No, it's not unique to Israel. Tithing is not unique to Israel, right? Like, there's all these cultural things that you're like, oh, I did not know any of this stuff, right? And so resources like that are really, really helpful in reading Scripture because there's stuff that's just like, I wouldn't have done that, right? I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't read this stuff. So ultimately, and this is the passage that I referenced earlier, right? All Scripture is inspired by God. We believe that the 66 books of the Bible are authoritative. They're inerrant, even though they're spoken through human authors. That there's not a flaw there. Now, we can get into the weeds of we can get into the weeds of what does inerrancy mean? Like, what does it mean that it's without flaw, right? There's some debate there about what do we do with like the age of the earth and Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and all of that kind of stuff, right? And yeah, there's a lot of different positions on that. To me, personally, and this may frustrate some of you if you like really want to get into like an argument about that. To me personally, I don't care. What I care about is what leads us to Jesus. And so, like, if the earth is 6,000 years old, 8,000 years old, 13.7 billion years old, I don't care. I care what gets us to Jesus. So if I'm talking to somebody and they're like dogmatically like young earth creation, then like, sure, yeah, there's a way to interpret the text that makes sense that results in young earth creation, right? But if they're like dogmatically old earth creation, like, okay, yeah, there's a way to interpret the text that makes sense. That's old earth creation. And so what we mean when we're talking about inerrancy is there's a scholar named John Walton that I think this is a really great way to think of it of Scripture. Is Scripture is not written to us; it's written for us. And so the Bible wasn't written to you; it was written for your benefit. And so what we mean by that is that there are times where well, most of the time, all the time, we have to think about what is this trying to affirm, right? What is this trying to affirm to the original audience? And when we get into these debates about, the age of the earth and that sort of thing, we're probably going outside the bounds of what the original audience would have cared about, right? Ancient people weren't as concerned about chronology as they were function. And so the creation narrative in the ancient world has more to do with separating things out and giving things a name and a purpose than how old is it, right? So we want to make sure that we're honoring the original context, that we're honoring the original authors, right? Another video from the BibleProject. Like I said, these guys are great.
The Bible's an important book, but it's really long.
Yeah, it's a collection of many books written over a long period of time, but altogether they tell one unified story.
So, what's the story of the Bible?
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
Or in Hebrew, Adam.
and they're made as God's image.
Which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil.
Or
They could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
and they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result, they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately, a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails. Who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament. We're introduced to a man who comes from the line of Israel's kings, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that he was bringing all these promises to their completion.
He confronted that dark, mysterious evil that all humanity has given into and resisted its power.
And then he announced that God had arrived to rule the world through himself. Jesus taught about God's definition of good and evil, and he said that real power is serving others. According to Jesus, it's people who love the poor and even love their enemies. These are the kinds of people who actually rule the world.
And that's confusing, but also really beautiful.
And so is the claim that the story goes on to make about Jesus, that he is God become human, to be for Israel and for all humanity what we could never be for ourselves. He came to take the consequences of our evil into himself, and his sacrificial love proved more powerful than evil, than even death itself.
So now humanity's presented with a new choice.
Represented by a new tree.
Stick with the old way of being human, or venture into this new way.
And in the story, those who choose the way of Jesus find themselves energized by God's own power. People who know that they are loved and forgiven by God can become people who love and forgive others in return.
The Jesus movement quickly spread throughout the world, forming these new communities of people who follow the way of Jesus.
But they faced problems. There was persecution from the outside by people in power, and inside there was confusion, even compromise.
Yeah, because following Jesus is really hard.
And so the movement's leaders, called apostles, they wrote letters to comfort and to challenge these communities to stay faithful to the difficult way of Jesus.
And they're called to hope for the day when Jesus will come and change everything.
And so the Bible ends by pointing to the future day, when all wrongs are made right, when evil is eradicated, heaven and earth are united, and humanity can rule the world together in the love and power of God.
Okay, so that's the story of the Bible, and it brings all of these books together.
But what's interesting is that each book contains a different kind of literature that contributes to this story in a unique way, and that's what the next video will begin to explore.
Questions on any of that thus far? Big story of the Bible, all pointing towards Jesus, all that stuff. Yeah, we're doing okay. Okay, let's take like 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and move towards